different countries working together in a shared community. And so I'm very grateful to be here. But for today, it matters in a different way that I am in a different country. In the United States, today is a holiday called Juneteenth. The name combines the month of June and the day, the 19th. And this is because on June 19th, 1865, this day is honored as the end of slavery in the United States, when the state of Texas and the enslaved people there finally got the news that the South had surrendered and that all enslaved people were free. This year, Juneteenth comes with a sobering reminder that mass slavery was followed by ongoing structural racism, political disenfranchisement, economic exclusion, social oppression. The police brutality that we continue to see in the United States grows out of and continues that long history of violence and injustice. And most recently, the cold-blooded killing of George Floyd by a police officer less than a month ago on May 25th has sparked massive protests against police brutality all over the states, with outrage and anti-racism protests internationally. And Troels has already told us about what's happened to the statue of Edward Colston in connection with that. And this brings me to my topic today. Things are happening to statues. In the US, protesters are attacking, pulling down, or forcing the removal of Confederate monuments and other racist symbols. In other countries, protesters are attacking statues of slave traders and imperialists. And in this spectacular fall from grace in Bristol, the statue of the slave trader Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into the harbor. In today's talk, I argue that these statue destructions merit a closer look. Now, this is a departure from what I had originally planned to talk about. And that change has been shaped by the coronavirus, by the closure of libraries. Stanford's library only started reopening this past week, and now by these extraordinary protests. So let me offer you a revised title: Statue Destructions During the George Floyd Protests, Modern Materialities of Old Statues. And so in some ways, this is very different from the really interesting papers we have heard so far in this seminar. And in other ways, this is completely related to everything that's been said so far. In the next half hour, I will first have a look at what's happening to statues during the current protests. Second, I'll try to think a bit about a theoretical framework. Third, I think thinking about ancient Roman damnationes is really helpful to us. And then I'll try to pull it all together to understand these modern materialities of old statues. And if I may quote Troels, he has this beautiful line in his 2013 book, "Destruction can be part of a vocabulary of religious and political expression that creates new meanings as much as it destroys old ones." And that's what I think we are seeing. So what's happening with statues? Well, since George Floyd was killed on May 25th, we have seen ongoing protests. And in the United States, statues and monuments in more than 30 cities, that was the count on June 12th, and it continues, have been defaced and destroyed or removed as part of the protests against police brutality and racism. And mostly Confederate statues are being targeted, but they have also spread. So here's another, in Birmingham, Alabama, another Confederate statue. This is a sea captain, oops, sorry about the misspelling, a sea captain who volunteered for the South during the Civil War. Local authorities are sometimes moving these statues, and you can see that's a very, very different kind of treatment and kind of removal. Here is the still very clean and dignified statue of Jefferson Davis, the president of the South during the Civil War, being carefully removed by public order. I'll come back to these differences. but it's spreading. It's beyond Confederate memorials. I won't go through all of these in details, but we have a Philadelphia police chief who was notorious for police brutality. Statues of Christopher Columbus, who is up as the European discoverer of the Americas, but also symbolizes for many people the genocide of Native Americans. We have Juan de Oñate in New Mexico. We have Texas Ranger in Dallas. We have figures of pioneers. This is spreading. Just to show you what's happening, a statue of Christopher Columbus was beheaded in Boston. It has since been removed. Down here, even Thomas Jefferson, a very controversial founding father. The statue was pulled down. This is in Oregon. And you can see the graffiti points out that he's a slave owner. This is a man who owned more than 600 other people. And it's in memory or provoked by the death of George Floyd, who was held down with a knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So we see in these visual spectacles how these things connect. And of course, this is happening outside the United States as well. We've already talked about Colston. Here's Robert Milligan, a different slave trader, who on June 9th had his head shrouded and a placard put up. And since then, he's been removed by local authorities. And of course, in Belgium, statues of King Leopold II are being attacked because of this, because of the atrocities in Congo that he is held personally responsible for. And even a figure like Winston Churchill is coming in for graffiti. Churchill was a racist, and on the statue is taped a sign saying Black Lives Matter. In Oxford, the South African movement of Rhodes Must Fall has been renewed, and Oriel College, I think just 2 days ago, agreed that the statue of Cecil Rhodes would come down from the facade of Oriel College. So what we're seeing with these statue destructions, statue defacements, is a globalized protest movement. And this is an important symbolic piece of what's happening. And of course, as many people are pointing out, this is an ongoing, but now very public and spectacular reckoning with these monuments and with memory and with how figures and ideas should be commemorated in public space. I want to say a couple more things about the Confederate statues. Research was done a few years ago by the Southern Poverty Law Center, looking at when these Confederate monuments were put up in the United States. And they weren't put up right after the war. Here's the Civil War over here at the left side of your slide. It lasted for 4 years. 35 years later, the peak of Confederate monuments begins. That's when the peak is, during these first 2 decades of the 20th century. And we should link these very explicitly to what was happening legally with the establishment of segregationist laws, economically with disenfranchisement and violence, economically speaking, exclusion from opportunity. We should link this to very, very strong social racism and the behaviors and taboos and violence that went along with that. This is the great age of the Ku Klux Klan and the kind of racial terrorism that they practiced. And these are the great years of lynching. So if we look at Confederate monuments, you know, it's important to think of them as a kind of sculptural terrorism, if you will. The second peak, now this is exactly the same slide continuing now. There's a second peak of Confederate monuments in the United States, pardon me. Here in the late 50s and early 60s, and this is in response to civil rights and in response to desegregations of schools. And if you look at how many green dots there are, those were all Confederate monuments put up at schools, in front of schools. Whereas before, in the big peak in the early 20th century, I would just call your attention to the blue dots, which are monuments on courthouse grounds. So imagine, you know, coming to trial, coming to try to get justice, and what greets you is a Confederate statue. So the placement of these things was always very important part of the racist message. Now, the primary organization are these people, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Now, we should say that one thing that was happening was lost cause mythology, where in the 20th, especially in the early 20th century, there was this recasting of the Civil War as being not about slavery. It was supposed to be about states' rights. And all these Confederate generals and soldiers were seen as heroic figures. They may have lost the battle, but they exemplified gallantry. And this kind of mythology is still very much operative in the South. So the United Daughters of the Confederacy set themselves up as a heritage organization, but they are the main organization who was responsible for erecting these memorials. They put up over 700 of them. And it is no coincidence at all that on May 31st, just a couple of weeks ago, the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in Richmond was defaced and set on fire. And the message there, I think, for us to think about is that the current defacements and destructions are historically very knowledgeable, and they're very strategically targeted. There's a reason why the UDC building was attacked. I should just mention why these are so hard to get rid of. One would think with this disgraceful, terrible history, it would be easy to say, okay, enough, let's just get rid of these things. And it's very, very difficult. It's been accelerated since 2015 when there was this massacre of 9 African Americans in Charleston, South Carolina. The killer was all over social media holding Confederate flags. And in the immediate aftermath of this terrible event, Confederate flags were removed from a lot of public space. But not that many. You know, again, 114 Confederate monuments were removed in the following years, but far more, you know, over 10 times as many still stood. These are hard to remove for all kinds of reasons. White supremacist organizations obviously identify with them, but people also see these as kind of war memorials and memorials of dead family members who fought for the South. Other people will espouse a line saying, we might not like the history, but it is history and we shouldn't just destroy it or try to erase it. And then there's a lot of just stasis about this, just inertia. But I just want to illustrate why this is so difficult, some of the thorniness of all of this. And I just want to look real quick at this statue of Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee, of course, is the commanding general of the Army of the South. So he is perhaps the most common figure in these statues. And so here's the statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. Dedicated in 1924, again, during this period of peak Confederate monuments. And of course, you know, many cities and towns want to get rid of these things. And in Charlottesville, there was a vote to remove it, which then incited multiple protests. And the notorious and very deadly Unite the Right rally that happened in 2017 and that led to the death of a woman when a neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd. This was about the removal of this statue. It was a protest against the removal of this statue. So in the aftermath of this terrible event, the city council voted to shroud the statue. Since it couldn't be removed, they would shroud it. But what's happened since then is that the statue has been ruled a war memorial, which means it cannot be touched. So what the city has done now is put up this construction fencing, and there are no trespassing signs. And so this still stands even today. One of the really important things about the current statue destructions and the current protests is that they are changing this situation in some visible ways. Number one, the protests, of course, are huge and ongoing, and they visibly seem to express the will of the people. It's hard to argue with massive protests that go on and on and on. And the physical statue defacements and destructions literally represent, very physically represent these figures and symbols in a different way. They are painted with slogans. They are shown or represented as deserving of outrage. Another reason these protests are, the statue destructions anyway, are working is that they are intensely local. They act on specific places and specific monuments. in the United States, the broader protests tend to do very little at the federal level. They tend to have no effect whatsoever, but they do have an effect locally. And we're also seeing, for instance, local changes in police departments and how they work. Another thing, these statue destructions simply pull statues down. I mean, they just slice through the Gordian knot of some of these bureaucratic logjams. They simply get it done. And one of the useful things then for sympathetic local authorities is that they have a new weapon they can use. There are a lot of state laws saying you can't touch these things, you can't take them down, but the cities can say, no, we have to, because now it's an issue of public safety. So it's changed the discourse in several ways. One of the ironic aspects of the current removals is that it's not just the protesters and sympathetic local authorities who are removing the protests. The United Daughters of the Confederacy themselves have started removing their own statues to keep them safe from desecration, which is kind of a wonderful irony. This is the very organization that was most involved in putting these things up, and they are now spending the money to take them down. And then there are these wonderful mixes. I won't dwell on this one. Here's an obelisk shape that commemorated Confederate soldiers and sailors, again erected by the United Daughters of the Confederacy at the beginning of the 20th century. After 2017, the mayor put up plywood barriers, but this was seen then by the state as violating the law about defacing war memorials, and they made them take it down, and they fined them $25,000. But then George Floyd protesters attacked this obelisk. An Egyptologist saw that they were not succeeding in bringing it down, and so she tweeted instructions about how to dismantle an obelisk, drawing on ancient Egyptian knowledge. So this was then happening, and the Birmingham mayor showed up and spoke to the protesters and is quoted in the news as saying, "Allow me to finish the job for you." And here we then see the heavy machinery brought in to lift this thing down. So things are changing in interesting ways when it comes to these memorials in public space. Now that's a brief overview, but I think we can understand a little more by thinking about a theoretical framework. Our existing framework for thinking about statue destructions is very much informed by negative actions, very loathsome destructive actions like the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, or ISIS in museums and on archaeological sites in Iraq and in Syria, mainly in 2015. And here I find Ömür Harmanshah's analyses very helpful, because at the time, of course, as we know, most archaeologists in the West were responding purely in terms of outrage against this destruction. And Harmanshah really pointed out how carefully staged this was for a global audience. You know, what these men were wearing, the tools they used, the way that this was put up on global media. This was very much an attack on a certain way of valuing cultural heritage. And although I think we can still lament this kind of destruction, one of the important messages here is that cultural heritage is not exempt. It does not stand apart from larger systems of conflict. Well, if we think about the current protests, they're profoundly different because so many people are sympathetic this time, right? This is very different from the Bamiyan Buddhas or what ISIS was doing, because many people would agree that the slavers are bad, that Confederate memorials shouldn't be up. And so this is also then a chance to think about these destructions and what they mean, or how they work. So in the case of Colston, I really recommend watching the videos of what happened, because they are so performative. These destructions are so performative and so physical. So here the statue was pulled down with ropes. Then there was this profoundly symbolic moment when a protester kneeled on the neck of Colston, obviously recalling the death of George Floyd. And of course, this is powerful and meaningful partly because a gesture that is so almost intimate, right? It's in a crowd. It's about one statue and one person's body. We would not see it except that this is a global spectacle, and that's part of what's happening and part of the power of what's happening, right? Pictures are taken and then posted, and so I can recreate this kind of sequence here from California to show you in Denmark. So very famously, of course, this statue was rolled down the street, complete still with its paint, with the ropes that around the feet that were partly used to pull it down. And then it was thrown into the harbor, and you can see everybody with their cameras. This is then recorded. This is both physical and virtual at the same time. It's a massive spectacle. We all participate in that sense. One thing I want to draw out, and another big difference from what ISIS was doing, is that this is not an attack on the system of valuing cultural heritage. These statue defacements and destructions work very much within the existing system of valuation. They work within the system that says a figural statue put up on a public pedestal is being treated as a figure of honor, and therefore protest against it is articulated in the forms of dishonor. And we see that very vividly here. This is another statue destruction in Richmond, Virginia, this time of Christopher Columbus. And the protest organized around this was very much in solidarity with the anti-racism protests. This is an indigenous peoples protest, but the way the statue was treated is very similar to the way other statues are being treated right now. So this one gets painted with red paint, you know, to evoke Christopher Columbus, has blood on his hands, the blood of the people who died. Slogans are painted all over the surface. The statue itself was pulled down, again with ropes, and dragged to a nearby pond and dumped in, and then a sign commenting on this was left next to the pond. The city has now pulled the statue out, and it is in storage somewhere, we don't know where, but the spectacle remains. So one question is then, how do we theorize this? How do we think about this? Is it iconoclasm? I would say no, that's not a particularly helpful term because iconoclasm speaks both to the destruction and to the perceived power of the image itself, as though the destruction would neutralize the power of the image. But that's of course not what's happening here. The power of these monuments is not treated as though it resides in the images themselves, but in their associated symbolisms and in their associated materialities, which is to say the ideology and the power over public space that saw them chosen and installed in the first place, the racist actions and structural practices that were legitimized by that same thinking. So their destruction is important and powerful in a very different way. It's about making visible a history that has been suppressed or violently marginalized. Now there's really interesting work done on negative heritage. In the interest of time, I'm going to mostly skip over this, but one of the things we are seeing in this longer process that is having such a punctuated focus moment now is this very long and complicated shift from seeing Confederate statues as positive heritage, or treating them that way anyway, and the shift is then toward treating them as negative heritage. And of course, these ideas have been controversial from the start. It depends on who has the power to affect these changes in public space. And of course, one of the things to remember here is how actively this process of maintaining works. So every time graffiti gets put onto a statue, as here in 2017, money and time and energy are spent to clean it off. And then it restores a kind of pristine appearance, and then we have the public identity of this thing in its pristine state. But of course, these are active choices made. I will pass on just another example in what's recently happened to the Churchill statue in Parliament Square in London. A conservative MP came out and helped clean it up. So did some local members of the public, so did the city authorities. And so once again, Churchill is then restored to a kind of timeless appearance, but which erases then these various interventions. Now, I'm losing time, so I will pass over, sadly without mentioning, the weird things that happen to negative heritage, like these Soviet statue parks in Lithuania or in Budapest. We are not at that point in the United States. There is no organized way yet to deal with unwanted Confederate statues, partly because there has not been a change of political regime, right? The Soviet era is firmly in the past. It's separated, but Confederate monuments are within a government and a system that has not changed. So various things are happening. In Dallas, for instance, a Robert E. Lee statue was brought down. It was put up for auction. It was sold for $1.4 million, and it was bought by a private individual who has now put it up on a private golf course near the Mexico border. So in these weird sort of individual trajectories, there will be in the future, I think, things to say about how these are treated. But let me say one last thing about theorizing what's happening now. There's been a lot of great work on monumentality and then anti-monumentality. And of course, these transitions are exactly what's happening on these monuments right now. So an affirmative and glorifying kind of presentation is through graffiti, through treatment, through people's protests, is turned into a focus on suffering, a focus on the victims. The great verticality and permanence is then very violently brought down and made anti-permanent and anti-monumental. Sites of these Confederate monuments are often like any other traditional monument. They are axial, they are visible, they are set apart. Lots of anti-monumental works are then very carefully not visible or axial. They are meant to be stumbled over. I would add a piece there, which is that with these Confederate monuments, what we are seeing is a reclaiming of the space, a treatment of the space now as different. And one aspect of this is that where a traditional monument gets admired at a remove, what is happening now is very close physical encounters. And of course, the single unified message of a glorifying monument is now turned into ambiguity. So I want to move forward to the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, which of course is one of these traditional monuments. It's 60 feet tall and this giant pedestal. It's at the intersection of streets in Richmond, Virginia. And what's happening, of course, is that it's the focus of protests. The protesters were tear gassed. This has led the mayor to fire the police chief because that is seen as police brutality. These were peaceful protesters. And where I just want to pause for a minute is what has been happening since. The governor of the state of Virginia controls this monument, and the governor has said it's going to be removed. And a celebration has broken out. I will just quote somebody on Twitter who says Black people all over the city are doing photo shoots at the new and improved Confederate memorials. So here is this reworking of space instead of this, awesome distant base with the statue on top. People have been climbing all over the monument, recasting it with all of these messages of protest and Black Lives Matter. And now people are coming and doing celebratory acts. They are dancing, they are celebrating graduations. There is a moment in which the same monument in the same space, still standing, has been transformed temporarily into an anti-monument, into a people's monument. Now this is short-lived because the city has since moved in and installed concrete barriers around that monument. So that moment in the history of this monument is sadly over. Now, Roman Damnatio Memoriae, I think, helps us think about how personal these attacks on these statues are. We all know that when a famous person, here the Emperor Caligula, fell from grace, the memory was condemned as well. So statues could be attacked and inscriptions could be erased, or a head could simply be recut. Here is a head that started out as the head of Domitian, famously recut to show his successor, Nerva. But the point I want to make here is that Roman damnatio is not about erasure or oblivion, right? This is not Soviet style erasure of a fallen figure as though he never existed. In this retouched photo, it looks like this Secret Service police chief disappeared without existing. That is not the forgetting that is happening here. What we are getting is a much more Roman style damnatio memoriae, right? The public spectacle of bodily disgrace, this organized and yet very collective, spontaneous, spectacular, very public set of interventions. The disgrace visited on the statues because, of course, social bodies and social statues are in some ways interchangeable. You can attack either one to attack social dignity. And of course, the Romans never forgot that this is about power and violence and actual bodies and what happens to people's bodies. So really the Roman damnatio memoriae is much more fitting. It's not an erasure of memory, it's a disgrace of memory, a condemnation of memory. And of course, as we know, one of the aspects of Roman damnatio is that you keep the damnatio visible, that the traces remain. So here, when Sejanus, the head of the Praetorian Guard under Tiberius, was accused of plotting to kill the emperor, he suffered a damnatio memoriae, and here his name has been scratched out. But you can still see where it was scratched out. You can see that something was scratched out. Here, Septimius Severus and his family, the next emperor Caracalla, proclaimed a damnatio memoriae against his brother Geta, whose face was then carefully marked out. What we can see here, of course, is that the rest of the family is intact. The category of imperial power is intact. So it's a little bit different from what we're seeing now. But it's heartening then to see that the current plan in Bristol is to take the statue of Edward Colston and put it up in a museum complete with these recent interventions, complete with the traces of the damnatio. So to sum up, I would just insist that this is not about erasing history at all, that what we're seeing in these current statute damnationes is a coherent form of political action, very historically informed, very specifically targeted, very constant, context-specific, and globally spectacular. So in that sense, they are global, to use a word from globalization studies. They extend the materialities far beyond the figure, and they mobilize the language of honorific statuary and its anti-monumentality to tear down that honor, and they give a very powerful possibility for emotional and angry and outraged actions. And what these current destructions do is remind us that change and destruction are built into all monuments, and that change and destruction can be creative and vital, and let us hope, democratic. Thank you.